When my daughter got married, I kept quiet that I'd inherited my late wife's fortune. Good thing I stayed silent because a week later my son-in-law and his entire family showed up with a notary, but her smile disappeared when... I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I'm Norman, and I'm 64 years old. Today should have been one of the happiest days of my life, watching my daughter Haley walk down the aisle in the same church where Katie and I exchanged vows 35 years ago. Instead, I sat in that wooden pew with my hands folded, carrying a secret that felt heavier than the grief I'd been shouldering for the past 18 months. Katie had been gone for a year and a half now, and not a day passed without me missing her laugh, her terrible cooking, or the way she'd hum while tending to her roses in our backyard. What I hadn't told anyone, not even Haley, was what Katie had left behind. $8,200,000, hidden away in trusts, investments, and accounts that only I knew about. The morning Katie passed, she had gripped my hand with what little strength she had left and whispered, "Norman, promise me something. Don't tell anyone about the money until you're absolutely certain they love you for who you are, not what you have." I promised her, and I'd kept that promise even as I struggled with loneliness and the weight of managing everything alone. Now, sitting in St. Mary's Catholic Church, watching my only child marry someone I barely knew, I was grateful for Katie's wisdom. Because something about Blake Morrison, my new son-in-law, had been bothering me since the day Haley brought him home 2 years ago. The ceremony was beautiful. Haley looked radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace dress, the same one Katie had worn when we married. But while other fathers might have been focused on their daughter's happiness, I found myself watching Blake's family. His parents, Robert and Linda Morrison, sat in the front row dressed in clothes that screamed money. His sister Charlotte kept checking her phone during the vows, and his brother Marcus was more interested in the stained glass windows than the actual ceremony. What struck me most was how they talked about money. During the rehearsal dinner the night before, I'd overheard Robert asking Haley pointed questions about family assets and whether I'd set anything aside for her future. When Haley mentioned that I lived comfortably on my pension, Linda had pursed her lips like she'd tasted something sour. $3,500 a month isn't exactly comfortable, she'd muttered to Robert, loud enough for me to hear. The thing is, they were right about my pension, but they had no idea about the rest. After the ceremony, as we gathered for photos in the church garden, Blake's father approached me with a firm handshake and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Norman, wonderful ceremony. Katie would have been proud." He paused, glancing around the modest garden. "I hope you know that Blake comes from a family that believes in taking care of each other. Financial transparency, shared responsibilities, that sort of thing." I nodded politely, but something cold settled in my stomach. "That's nice, Robert." "We've always taught our children that marriage isn't just about love," he continued, his voice taking on a businesslike tone. "It's about building something together, combining resources, making smart decisions about the future." I looked across the garden where Haley was laughing with her bridesmaids, completely unaware of the conversation happening 20 feet away. "Haley's happiness is all that matters to me." Robert's smile tightened. Of course. But surely you've thought about how you'll support the young couple as they get started. Blake mentioned you own your home outright and with your military pension." "Blake mentioned that, did he?" "Oh yes, the kids talk. Nothing wrong with that." Robert chuckled, but it sounded forced. "Blake just wants to make sure Haley never has to worry about anything. He's very protective of her." I excused myself and walked over to where Katie's roses still bloomed along the church's eastern wall. She'd helped plant them 15 years ago as part of a beautification project. Now they were in full bloom, their deep red petals catching the afternoon sunlight. "You were right, weren't you?" I whispered to the roses, remembering Katie's final warning. The reception was held at the Morrison family's country club, a sprawling facility with crystal chandeliers and servers in white gloves. Blake had insisted on paying for everything, which had seemed generous at the time. Now I wondered if it was an investment. During dinner, I sat at the family table between Haley and an empty chair that should have been Katie's. The Morrisons dominated the conversation, talking about their real estate investments, their vacation home in Aspen, and their plans to help the young couple get established. "Blake's already looking at houses," Linda announced, cutting her salmon with precise movements. "Nothing too extravagant to start, but something with good bones, a foundation to build on." Charlotte, Blake's sister, leaned forward with interest. "Are you thinking about the Henderson place? That's been on the market for months." "Too expensive for newlyweds," Marcus chimed in, "unless there's family help involved." All eyes turned to me. I took a sip of water and smiled. "I'm sure they'll figure something out." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Robert cleared his throat. "Norman, we hope you don't mind us being forward, but we're family now. Blake mentioned you might need help managing your finances. It's a lot for one person, especially at your age." I felt my jaw clench. "I manage just fine." "Of course you do," Linda said quickly. "We just know how overwhelming it can be. Robert handles all our investments, and we'd be happy to help you maximize what you have." "That's very kind, but unnecessary." Blake finally spoke up, his voice carefully casual. "Dad just means that we want to make sure you're taken care of, Norman. You're family now." I looked at my new son-in-law, really looked at him, and saw something that chilled me. His expression was concerned, caring even, but his eyes were calculating. He was measuring me, evaluating what I might be worth. Later that evening, as the reception wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself alone on the country club's terrace. The night air was warm, filled with the sound of crickets and distant laughter from inside. Haley appeared beside me, still radiant in her wedding dress. "Dad, are you okay? You seemed quiet tonight." I put my arm around her shoulders, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume. "Just missing your mother." "I miss her too." Haley leaned against me. "Do you think she would have liked Blake?" The question hung in the air. Katie had been an excellent judge of character. She could spot a fake smile from across a room and had an uncanny ability to see through people's motives. "What do you think she would have said?" Haley was quiet for a moment. "She would have said to follow my heart." "And what does your heart tell you?" "That I love him." But there was something uncertain in her voice, a hesitation that hadn't been there 6 months ago. I kissed the top of her head. "Then that's what matters." But as I watched Blake through the terrace doors, laughing with his family while they gestured in our direction, I knew Katie would have seen right through him. She would have noticed how he'd been asking questions about our house, our finances, our future plans. She would have seen the way his family looked at me like I was a puzzle to be solved rather than a person to be welcomed. The worst part was realizing that Blake had probably been planning this conversation for months, maybe even since he'd started dating Haley. The questions, the casual mentions of money, the way he'd positioned himself as someone who could help me manage my affairs. As I drove home that night, past the familiar streets of our neighborhood, I thought about the envelope Katie had sealed and hidden in our bedroom safe before she died. Inside were detailed instructions about the money, about how to protect it and when to reveal it. She'd been sick for months before she passed, but her mind had remained sharp until the end. "Trust is earned, Norman," she'd told me during one of her last lucid days, "and some people will try to earn it for all the wrong reasons." I pulled into our driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes, looking at the house we'd bought 40 years ago, with a VA loan and a prayer. It was modest by today's standards, a 3-bedroom ranch with a small front yard and Katie's beloved rose garden in the back. To most people, it looked like the home of a retired man living on a military pension. They had no idea that the man inside was worth more than all of them combined. As I unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet hallway, I felt the weight of Katie's secret pressing down on me. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of the people around me, but tonight I just wanted to remember the feeling of watching my daughter get married, before the reality of what Blake and his family really wanted became impossible to ignore. I walked to the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee, Sitting at the small round table where Katie and I had shared thousands of meals and conversations, her chair across from me was empty as it had been for 18 months, but I could almost hear her voice. "Watch them carefully, Norman. They'll show you who they really are soon enough." And deep in my heart, I knew she was right. 7 days. That's how long Blake and Haley had been married when the Morrisons showed up at my door with a notary public and a folder full of documents. I was in my workshop in the garage, refinishing an old rocking chair that had belonged to Katie's grandmother when I heard the doorbell ring. The rhythmic sanding motion had become a form of meditation for me since Katie passed. It kept my hands busy and my mind focused on something other than the emptiness in our house. When I opened the front door, I found Robert Morrison standing there in a charcoal business suit, despite it being a Saturday morning. Behind him were Linda, Charlotte, Marcus, and a woman I didn't recognize carrying a leather briefcase. "Norman!" Robert's voice boomed with false cheer. "Hope you don't mind us dropping by. We brought someone we'd like you to meet." I looked past them to see Blake's car in my driveway, but no sign of Haley. "Where's my daughter?" "Oh, she's at home unpacking wedding gifts," Linda said with a dismissive wave. "This is more of a family business matter." The woman with the briefcase stepped forward and extended her hand. "Mr. Holloway, I'm Patricia Hendricks, notary public. The Morrison family has asked me to witness some important documents today." I didn't take her hand. "Documents?" Robert clapped me on the shoulder like we were old friends. "Norman, we need to talk. May we come in?" Every instinct Katie had taught me about reading people was screaming danger, but I stepped aside and let them into my living room. They arranged themselves on my furniture like they were setting up for a business meeting. Patricia placed her briefcase on Katie's coffee table and began removing official-looking papers. "Norman, please sit down," Robert said, gesturing to my own recliner like he was the host. "What we're about to discuss is for your own good." I remained standing. "I think you'd better tell me what this is about." Linda spoke up, her voice taking on the tone someone might use with a confused elderly person. "Norman, we're family now, and family takes care of each other." "Blake told us you've been struggling since Katie passed," Charlotte added, "managing finances, keeping track of bills, that sort of thing." That was news to me. I'd never mentioned any financial struggles to Blake because I wasn't having any. "I'm managing fine." Marcus pulled out a manila folder. "We've done some research, Norman. We know about your pension, your mortgage situation, the current value of your home." The blood in my veins turned to ice. "You've been researching me?" "Not researching," Robert said quickly. "Just trying to understand how we can help. Blake is very worried about you living alone in this big house, trying to manage everything by yourself." Patricia cleared her throat and held up a document. "Mr. Holloway, this is a simple financial power of attorney arrangement. It would allow the Morrison family to help you manage your assets more efficiently." I stared at the paper in her hands. "You want me to sign over control of my finances?" "Not control," Linda protested. "Assistance. We just want to make sure you're not being taken advantage of, that your money is working as hard as it should be." "And what money would that be?" The question hung in the air. Robert and Linda exchanged glances. Finally, Robert leaned forward. "Norman, we know Katie left you something. Blake mentioned that you've been secretive about your financial situation since she passed." "Blake said that?" Charlotte nodded enthusiastically. "He's concerned that you might be hiding assets out of some misplaced sense of pride. But there's no shame in having money, Norman. The shame would be in not managing it properly." I felt a surge of anger so intense it took my breath away. Not at the Morrisons, but at myself, for not seeing this coming. Blake had been pumping my daughter for information about my finances, and I'd been too distracted by grief to notice. "Let me understand this correctly," I said slowly. "You've researched my financial situation, discussed my private affairs with Blake, and now you want me to sign legal documents giving you access to my accounts?" "It's not like that," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Then what is it like? Patricia opened her briefcase wider and pulled out more papers. Mr. Holloway, we've also prepared some estate planning documents. Given your age and recent loss, it's important to make sure Haley and Blake are protected. Protected from what? From taxes, from probate, from any number of complications that could arise, Robert explained. These documents would establish a family trust with Blake as the primary trustee. The room started to spin. They weren't just asking for access to my money, they wanted to control it, manage it, and ultimately inherit it. And they were using my daughter's marriage as leverage. I walked to the window that overlooked Katie's rose garden. The flowers were in full bloom, just like they had been at Haley's wedding a week ago. Katie used to say that roses were good judges of character because they only bloomed for people who truly cared for them. How long have you been planning this? I asked without turning around. Planning what? Linda's voice was defensive. This. The research, the documents, the whole intervention. Silence filled the room. Finally, Robert spoke. Norman, we're trying to help you. I turned back to face them. By taking control of my money? By protecting it, Charlotte said. Blake told us you've been making some questionable financial decisions lately, spending money on unnecessary things, getting confused about bills. Another lie. I'd never been more financially organized in my life. Katie's death had actually forced me to become more disciplined about managing our affairs. What unnecessary things? Marcus pulled out a small notebook. Blake mentioned you spent $1,500 on some kind of memorial garden project last month. I had to grip the back of my recliner to steady myself. The memorial garden had been my way of honoring Katie's memory at the church where we were married. I'd donated money to expand the rose garden where she'd volunteered for 15 years. That was a charitable donation. See, Linda said triumphantly, that's exactly what we're talking about. $1,500 is a lot of money for someone on a fixed income. And Blake told you about this donation? He's worried about you, Norman, Robert said. He sees you making these emotional decisions with money you can't afford to lose. The manipulation was so sophisticated, so carefully planned, that I almost admired their thoroughness. They'd positioned themselves as concerned family members trying to protect a grieving widower from his own poor judgment. And they'd used my daughter's new husband to gather intelligence about my financial situation. Patricia cleared her throat again. Mr. Holloway, these documents just need your signature. We can have everything finalized today. I looked at each of them in turn. Robert, with his expensive suit and practiced smile, Linda, with her perfectly styled hair and calculating eyes, Charlotte and Marcus, both young and hungry, already spending money that didn't belong to them, and Patricia, a professional who'd been hired to legitimize what was essentially a sophisticated con game. Where's Blake? I asked. He thought it would be better if we handled this as a family, Robert said. Without Haley? She gets emotional about money matters, Linda explained. We thought it would be easier to present her with a completed plan. That's when I understood the full scope of their operation. They weren't just after my money. They were systematically isolating me from my daughter, using Blake as an inside source and positioning themselves as my new family protectors. I walked over to where Patricia sat with her documents spread across Katie's coffee table. These papers would give Blake access to all my accounts? As trustee, yes, but only to manage them more effectively. And if I refuse? Robert's mask slipped slightly. Norman, we're trying to do this the easy way. But if you're not competent to manage your own affairs... The threat was implicit but clear. If I didn't cooperate, they'd find other ways to get what they wanted. They might even try to have me declared incompetent. I thought about Katie's envelope hidden in our bedroom safe. Inside were not just her instructions about the money, but also her concerns about the kind of people who might try to take advantage of me after she was gone. She'd been worried about scam artists and financial predators, but she'd never imagined they might come from within our own family. I need to think about this, I said finally. There's nothing to think about, Marcus said impatiently. We're offering to help you, not hurt you. Give me 24 hours. Robert stood up, his friendly demeanor cracking. "Norman, we've cleared our schedules to be here today. Patricia has other appointments. We really need to get this resolved now." The pressure was subtle but unmistakable. They wanted to rush me into signing before I had time to think, to seek advice, or to talk to Haley about what was happening. 24 hours, I repeated. Patricia began gathering her papers with obvious disappointment. "Mr. Holloway, I should mention that delaying could complicate things legally if there are questions about your capacity to make these decisions." Another threat, wrapped in professional concern. After they left, I sat in my recliner for a long time, staring at Katie's empty chair across from me. The house felt different now, violated somehow. They'd brought their greed and manipulation into the space where Katie and I had built our life together. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Haley's number, then stopped. What could I tell her? That her new husband had been spying on me for his family? That the people she now considered family were planning to steal from her father? Instead, I walked to our bedroom and opened the safe where Katie's envelope waited. Her handwriting on the outside was still clear. "For Norman, when you need to know who to trust." Inside, along with her instructions about the $8,200,000, was a letter addressed to me. "My dearest Norman," it began, "if you're reading this, it means someone has tried to take advantage of your good nature. Remember what I always told you, people will show you who they really are if you give them enough time. The money I'm leaving you isn't just an inheritance, it's a test. Use it to find out who loves you for yourself and who loves you for what you can give them." I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. Katie had known this day would come. She'd prepared me for it, even from beyond the grave. Tomorrow the Morrisons would return expecting my signature on their documents. But they had no idea what they were really asking for, or how much money they thought they could control. $8,200,000 was more than they'd ever dreamed of stealing from a lonely widower, and they were about to discover that some tests have very expensive consequences for those who fail them. The next morning, I called my lawyer. James Patterson had been handling my legal affairs for over 20 years, ever since Katie and I updated our wills when Haley graduated high school. He was one of the few people who knew about Katie's inheritance, having helped her set up the trusts and investment accounts during her final months. "Norman," his voice was warm but concerned when I explained why I was calling. "You need to come in immediately. Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and whatever you do, don't let them pressure you into making any decisions." I drove to his office that afternoon, my hands shaking slightly as I gripped the steering wheel. The Morrison family's visit had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. Not because of their threats, but because of what it meant about Blake, and by extension, what it might mean about Haley's marriage. James's office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, filled with law books and the comfortable clutter of a man who'd spent decades helping people navigate life's complications. He listened without interruption as I told him everything that had happened, from the wedding reception conversations to yesterday's ambush. "Norman, this is textbook elder financial abuse," he said when I finished. "The fact that they brought a notary suggests they've done this before." "What do you mean?" James pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. "The pressure, tactics, the isolation from family members, the manufactured urgency, even the research into your financial background. These people are professionals." I felt my stomach drop. "You think they planned this from the beginning?" "I think we need to find out." He reached for his phone. "I'm calling a friend of mine who specializes in fraud investigation. If the Morrison family has done this before, there will be a paper trail." While James made his calls, I sat in his office looking out at the street where Katie and I used to walk on Saturday mornings. We'd stop at the farmer's market, buy flowers for her garden, and talk about our plans for the week. Simple pleasures that seemed impossibly distant now. "Norman." James hung up his phone and turned back to me. "My investigator friend can have preliminary information by tomorrow, but I want you to do something for me tonight." "What?" "Go home and look through any paperwork Blake might have had access to. Bank statements, insurance documents, anything that might give him information about your financial situation." I drove home with a growing sense of dread. Blake had been too our house dozens of times during his 2-year courtship with Haley. He'd helped me with yard work, fixed a leaky faucet in the kitchen, even helped move some of Katie's belongings to the attic after she passed. I'd thought he was being helpful, but now I wondered what he'd really been doing. At home, I went straight to my home office, a small room off the kitchen where I kept files and paid bills. Everything looked normal at first glance, but as I examined my filing cabinet more carefully, I noticed something troubling. The manila folders were out of order. I'm meticulous about organization, a habit from my military days that Katie used to tease me about. Every document has its place, every file is labeled and arranged alphabetically. But now my bank statements were filed under B instead of the specific bank names, and my insurance papers were mixed in with tax documents. Someone had been through my files and tried to put them back without knowing my system. I pulled out my recent bank statements and spread them on the desk. Everything looked normal until I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were small pencil marks next to certain deposits and withdrawals. Not obvious marks, just tiny dots and lines that someone might use to remember important information. Blake had been taking notes on my financial transactions. I grabbed my phone and called Haley's cell, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried their landline and Blake answered on the second ring. "Norman, how are you feeling after yesterday's meeting?" The casual way he said it, like we'd discussed the weather instead of them trying to steal my money, made my jaw clench. "Blake, I need to speak with Haley." "She's in the shower. Can I take a message?" "Tell her to call me as soon as possible. It's important." There was a pause. "Is everything okay? You sound upset." "I'm fine. Just have her call me." "Actually, Norman, while I have you on the phone, did you have a chance to review those documents my family brought over?" The question was asked with studied casualness, but I could hear the hunger underneath it. "I'm still thinking about it." "Well, don't take too long. Dad mentioned that delaying could create legal complications." Another veiled threat. I hung up without responding. 20 minutes later, Haley called back. "Dad, Blake said you sounded upset. What's wrong?" I looked around my violated office at the evidence of months of careful surveillance and tried to figure out how to tell my daughter that her husband was a fraud. "Haley, I need you to come over. Alone." "Dad, you're scaring me. What's going on?" "Please, just come over. Don't tell Blake where you're going." She arrived an hour later, still in the yoga clothes she'd been wearing when she called. The moment she walked into the house, I could see the worry in her eyes. "Dad, talk to me. What happened yesterday that has you so upset?" I led her to the kitchen and made coffee, trying to organize my thoughts. "How do you tell your daughter that her marriage might be a lie?" "Haley, how much have you told Blake about our family's finances?" She frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, have you discussed my pension, the house, anything about money?" "Not really." She stirred sugar into her coffee, thinking. "I mean, he knows you own the house and that you get a pension. Why? Has he ever asked specific questions? About bank accounts, investments, inheritance from your mother?" Haley's frown deepened. "Dad, you're starting to worry me. Why are you asking these questions?" I took a deep breath. "Because yesterday Blake's family came here with a notary and tried to get me to sign documents giving them control of my finances." Her coffee mug hit the table with a sharp clink. "What?" I told her everything. The research they'd done on my background, the documents they wanted me to sign, the threats about having me declared incompetent if I didn't cooperate. With each detail, I watched my daughter's face grow paler. "That's impossible," she said finally. "Blake would never... his family wouldn't..." I showed her the disturbed files in my office, the pencil marks on my bank statements. "Someone has been going through my papers, Haley. Someone who had access to this house." She stared at the evidence, her hands trembling. "There has to be an explanation." "I hope there is, but I need you to think carefully. Has Blake ever been alone in this house? Has he ever asked you questions about money that seemed odd at the time?" Haley was quiet for a long moment, her coffee growing cold as she struggled with memories. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Last month, when you went to the doctor for your checkup, Blake offered to wait here for the repairman to fix the washing machine. I remembered that day. The appointment had taken longer than expected, and I'd come home to find Blake in the kitchen, claiming the repairman had just left. What else? A few weeks ago, he asked if you'd ever mentioned having life insurance. He said he was thinking about getting a policy for us and wondered what you recommended. She looked up at me with growing horror. Dad, I told him about the policy Mom had through her job, the one that paid off the house when she died. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Blake knew I owned the house free and clear, which would have made my modest pension seem more significant than it actually was. Haley, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. She nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. When did Blake first start talking about marriage? About 6 months ago. Why? Think about the timing. What was happening in our family 6 months ago? I watched her face as she worked backwards through the timeline. 6 months ago was when Katie's estate had finally been settled, when the last of her affairs had been handled through probate court. It was also when the local newspaper had published death notices that included basic information about survivors and estates. "Oh, God," Haley whispered, "the newspaper article about Mom's estate." The article had been standard legal notice, required by law when an estate goes through probate. It hadn't mentioned specific amounts, but it had listed me as the surviving spouse and primary beneficiary. Anyone who wanted to research further could have found more detailed information in the public records. Dad, are you telling me that Blake proposed to me because he thought you had money? Before I could answer, we heard a car door slam in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, I could see Blake's silver sedan parked behind Haley's car. "Did you tell him you were coming here?" I asked. Haley shook her head, her face pale. "I told him I was going to the grocery store." The front door opened without a knock, which struck me as presumptuous. Blake called out, "Haley, your car's here, but you're not answering your phone." We heard his footsteps crossing the living room toward the kitchen. Haley quickly wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself. Blake appeared in the doorway with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "There you are. I was worried when you didn't come home." His gaze moved between us, taking in the coffee cups and our serious expressions. "Am I interrupting something?" "Just visiting with Dad," Haley said, but her voice was strained. Blake's eyes landed on the bank statement still spread across the kitchen table. For just a moment, his carefully maintained composure slipped, and I saw something cold and calculating in his expression. "Norman, still reviewing those documents?" he asked casually, moving closer to the table. I gathered the papers and put them in a folder. "Just organizing some paperwork." Blake sat down uninvited and looked directly at me. "You know, my family is really hoping we can resolve this quickly. Dad's been making some calls, and apparently there are some time-sensitive issues with estate planning that we should address." "What kind of issues?" "Tax implications, mostly. If you wait too long to set up proper trusts and transfers, the IRS gets involved." Blake's voice was smooth, professional, like he'd rehearsed this conversation. "Dad's accountant says there could be penalties for delayed reporting of inherited assets." I felt my anger building. "Blake, I think there's been a misunderstanding about my financial situation." "What kind of misunderstanding?" Haley was watching both of us with growing concern, clearly sensing the tension but not understanding its source. "The kind where you assume I have more money than I actually do." Blake's smile tightened slightly. "Norman, we're not assuming anything. We're just trying to help family make smart financial decisions. And if I don't want your help?" The mask slipped again, just for a second. "Well, that would be unfortunate, especially for Haley's future security." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. If I didn't cooperate, there would be consequences for my daughter. "Blake," Haley said quietly, "maybe we should go home and let Dad think about this." "Actually, sweetheart, I think we should stay and work this out." Blake reached across the table and put his hand over mine. "Norman, you're family now. We just want what's best for everyone. I pulled my hand away and stood up. I think you should leave. Blake remained seated, his expression hardening. Norman, I don't think you understand the gravity of this situation. My family has invested considerable time and resources in trying to help you. We've cleared our schedules, hired professionals, done research. We expect a certain level of cooperation. Cooperation? Is that what you call trying to steal someone's money? Haley gasped. Dad! Blake stood up slowly, his friendly demeanor completely gone now. That's a very serious accusation, Norman. It's a very serious crime, Blake. We stared at each other across my kitchen table. The pretense finally dropped. I could see him calculating, trying to decide whether to continue the charade or reveal his true nature. Haley, he said without taking his eyes off me, your father is obviously not thinking clearly. Maybe we should discuss having him evaluated by a medical professional. The clinical way he said it, like he was discussing a broken appliance, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about helping family or managing assets. This was about removing any obstacle between Blake Morrison and $8,200,000 that he had no idea even existed. But I was done being his victim. Tomorrow I would start fighting back, and Blake Morrison had no idea what he was really fighting for. The phone call came at 6 in the morning, 2 days after Blake had threatened to have me declared incompetent. Dad? Haley's voice was small, broken. Can you come get me? I was out of bed and reaching for my clothes before she finished the sentence. Where are you? At the Marriott downtown, room 214. I drove through the empty streets with my heart pounding, wondering what had happened to put my daughter in a hotel room at dawn. When she opened the door, I barely recognized her. Her face was puffy from crying, her hair was disheveled, and she was wearing the same clothes she'd had on when Blake had confronted me in my kitchen 2 days earlier. Haley, what happened? She fell into my arms and started sobbing. You were right, Dad. You were right about everything. I held her while she cried, remembering all the times I'd comforted her as a child. When she scraped her knee learning to ride a bike, when her high school boyfriend broke her heart, when Katie got sick and we had to explain that Mommy wasn't going to get better. But this was different. This was the kind of heartbreak that changes a person forever. When her tears finally slowed, I helped her sit on the edge of the hotel bed. Tell me what happened. Haley wiped her nose with a tissue and took a shaky breath. After you accused Blake of trying to steal from you, I couldn't stop thinking about it. All the way home, I kept remembering things that didn't make sense at the time. She told me about the conversations she'd overheard between Blake and his family, how they'd discussed the old man's situation when they thought she wasn't listening, how Blake had asked detailed questions about Katie's death, about probate court, about whether I'd received any unexpected inheritance. I thought he was just being thoughtful, trying to understand what you were going through, she said. But yesterday morning, I found something. She pulled a manila folder from her overnight bag. Blake left this on his desk at home. I wasn't snooping, I was just looking for a phone number, but when I saw your name on the tab, I opened it. Inside the folder was everything I'd feared and more. Copies of public records about Katie's probate case, printed internet searches about elder financial abuse and incompetency proceedings, a handwritten timeline that started with target identified and ended with estate transfer complete. But the worst part was a photograph of me taken from inside my own house, apparently shot through the kitchen window while I was making coffee. They've been watching you, Dad, planning this for months. I studied the timeline more carefully. The target identified date was 3 weeks after Katie's death notice appeared in the newspaper. The entire courtship, the proposal, the wedding, it had all been a calculated operation designed to get close to me and my money. Haley, I'm so sorry. Don't apologize to me. I should have seen it. She pulled out more papers. Look at this. It was a detailed financial profile with my name at the top. Bank account numbers, estimated asset values, even the color and model of my car. At the bottom was a note in Blake's handwriting. Conservative estimate, 2 million plus house value. Actual amount likely higher based on wife's pharmaceutical company pension. They'd done their homework. Katie had worked for 30 years at a major pharmaceutical company before retiring, and her pension benefits had been substantial. What they hadn't discovered was that she'd also inherited money from her own mother, which had grown into a fortune through careful investing over the decades. "There's more," Haley said quietly. She handed me a printed email exchange between Blake and someone named David Morrison. The first email was from Blake. "Operation proceeding as planned. Target is isolated and vulnerable. Daughter completely trusting. Estimate 6 to 8 weeks until full financial access." David's response made my stomach turn. "Excellent work. This is exactly the kind of situation we've been looking for. Make sure you document any signs of mental incompetence. We'll need that for the legal proceedings." I looked up at my daughter. "Who is David Morrison?" "Blake's uncle. He's a lawyer who specializes in elder law." Haley's voice was flat, emotionless. "Apparently, this is something they do. They identify wealthy widows and widowers, then use family connections to gain access to their money." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. This wasn't just Blake being greedy. This was an organized family business built around financial elder abuse. "How many people are involved?" Haley showed me another document. "All of them. Blake's parents provided the initial research and capital. Charlotte handles the social media stalking to identify targets. Marcus manages the legal paperwork, and Blake is the one who gets close to the family members." I felt sick. "How many times have they done this before?" "According to what I found, at least 6 times in the past 5 years. Always the same pattern. Identify a lonely older person with money, infiltrate their family, gain their trust, then take control of their assets." She handed me a newspaper clipping from 2 years earlier. "Portland widow loses life savings to romance scam," read the headline. Below it was a photo of an elderly woman whose story sounded achingly familiar. She'd met a charming younger man after her husband's death. He'd married into the family, gained access to her finances, then disappeared with everything she owned. "Blake was married before," Haley whispered. "This woman was his first wife's grandmother." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. They'd targeted vulnerable people who were already grieving, who desperately wanted to believe that someone cared about them. They'd used love itself as a weapon. "Haley, when did you find all this?" "Yesterday afternoon, I confronted Blake when he came home from work." She started crying again. "Dad, he didn't even deny it. He just got angry that I'd found his files." I put my arm around her shoulders. "What did he say?" "He said I was being naive, that you were sitting on money you couldn't possibly need, and it was ridiculous for one old man to have so much when young people like us were struggling to get started in life." She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "He actually tried to make it sound noble, like he was Robin Hood stealing from the rich." "What else?" "He said the marriage didn't have to end, that if I stayed quiet and went along with the plan, we could all benefit. He promised me that you'd be taken care of, that his family would make sure you had everything you needed." The lie was so outrageous, it was almost impressive. Based on the documents she'd shown me, the Morrison family had never taken care of anyone except themselves. When I told him I was going to warn you, he said I was making the biggest mistake of my life, that his family had ways of dealing with people who didn't cooperate. I felt a chill run down my spine. "He threatened you?" "Not directly, but he said I didn't understand how powerful his family was, how many connections they had. He said if I tried to interfere with their business, I'd regret it." Looking at my daughter sitting in this anonymous hotel room, her marriage destroyed and her trust shattered, I felt an anger unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The Morrison family had stolen more than money from their victims. They'd stolen peace of mind, family relationships, and faith in human decency. "Dad, I'm scared. What if they try to hurt you?" "They won't hurt me, sweetheart." "How can you be so sure?" I thought about Katie's envelope, still hidden in our bedroom safe, about the $8,200,000 that the Morrison family thought they were stealing, when in reality, They were walking into a trap that had been set 18 months ago. Because they don't know who they're really dealing with. Haley studied my face. Dad, is there something you're not telling me? Before I could answer, her phone rang. Blake's name appeared on the screen. Don't answer it, I said. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. He's been calling all night, Haley said, leaving voicemails, sending texts. Some of them are apologetic, some of them are angry. What do they say? She played one of the voicemails on speaker. Blake's voice filled the hotel room, smooth and persuasive. Haley, baby, you're overreacting. We can work this out. My family cares about you, about Norman. We just want what's best for everyone. Come home and we'll talk through this like adults. The next message was different. Haley, you're making a serious mistake. My family has invested a lot of time and money in this relationship. If you think you can just walk away without consequences, you're wrong. Come home now or things are going to get complicated. I felt my protective instincts surge. Haley, you're not going back there. I know. I can't. I don't even recognize the person I married. She looked around the sterile hotel room. But I can't stay here forever either. What am I supposed to do? You're coming home with me, today. What about Blake? What about the rest of his family? They're not just going to give up. I thought about James Patterson, my lawyer, and the fraud investigator he'd contacted. By now they probably had enough evidence to involve law enforcement. But I also thought about Katie's final gift to me and the opportunity it presented. Let me worry about the Morrison family, I said. Dad, you don't understand how dangerous they are. These aren't just greedy relatives. They're criminals who've done this before. She was right. But what she didn't know was that this time they'd chosen the wrong target. For 18 months I'd been nothing more than a lonely widower living on a modest pension. But Katie had left me something more valuable than money. She'd left me the tools I needed to protect myself and my daughter from exactly this kind of predator. Haley, I need you to trust me. Can you do that? She nodded, wiping her eyes. What do you want me to do? Pack your things. We're going home and we're going to end this. As we drove back to my house, I thought about the phone call I would need to make to James Patterson, about the evidence Haley had collected, about the trap that Katie had helped me set without even knowing it. The Morrison family thought they were hunting a helpless old man, but they were about to discover that sometimes the prey is more dangerous than the predator, and sometimes justice comes with a price tag of $8,200,000. The Morrison family's response to Haley leaving was swift and vicious. It started with phone calls, not just to my house, but to my neighbors, to the church where Katie and I had been members for 20 years, even to the grocery store where I'd shopped for decades. Robert Morrison introduced himself as my concerned son-in-law and explained that I was suffering from dementia and making dangerous financial decisions. Mrs. Henderson from next door knocked on my door Tuesday morning with tears in her eyes. Norman, that nice young man who married Haley, called me. He said you've been confused lately, forgetting to pay bills, getting lost driving. She touched my arm gently. Honey, if you need help, you know Harold and I are here for you. I thanked her and assured her that I was fine, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. The Morrison family was laying groundwork for their incompetency claim by creating a narrative of mental decline among people who knew me. The legal pressure came next. Wednesday afternoon, a process server arrived at my door with a thick envelope. Inside were documents from Morrison & Associates, Blake's Uncle David's law firm. They were petitioning the court for an emergency guardianship hearing, claiming that I was a vulnerable adult in need of protection due to cognitive decline and financial mismanagement. Attached were sworn statements from Blake and his parents detailing my supposed mental lapses. According to their version of events, I'd become confused and paranoid since Katie's death. I'd made bizarre accusations about their attempts to help me. I'd been seen wandering around my neighborhood at odd hours, talking to myself. All lies, but presented with professional legal language that made them sound credible. The most damning document was a psychological evaluation report that Blake claimed to have commissioned out of concern for his wife's father. The report, signed by a Dr. Patricia Welsh, concluded that I showed significant signs of paranoid ideation and financial decision-making impairment consistent with early-stage dementia. I'd never met Dr. Patricia Welsh. "James," I said when I called my lawyer, "they've fabricated a psychological evaluation." "That's a felony," he replied grimly. "We need to document everything. Don't respond to any of their communications, don't sign anything, and whatever you do, don't let them bait you into any kind of confrontation." But the Morrison family wasn't done escalating. Thursday morning, I found Haley sitting at my kitchen table with tears streaming down her face, staring at her laptop screen. "Dad, they've created a GoFundMe page." I looked over her shoulder at the computer. There was a photo of me from Haley's wedding, smiling and looking perfectly normal. Below it was a heartbreaking story about a widowed veteran struggling with dementia while his greedy daughter tried to steal his money. The page claimed that Blake and his family were trying to protect me from financial abuse by my own daughter and needed funds to pay for legal fees to save me from exploitation. In less than 24 hours, they'd raised over $3,000 from strangers who believed they were helping a vulnerable old man. "Dad, people are sharing this on social media. Some of them know me from high school. They're calling me terrible names, saying I'm a monster for stealing from my own father." I put my arms around her as she sobbed. The Morrison family's strategy was becoming clear. They weren't just trying to steal my money. They were systematically destroying both of our reputations to make their version of events seem credible. "There's more," Haley whispered. "Blake filed for a legal separation. He's claiming that I've been psychologically abusive, that I've turned against him to help you hide money that rightfully belongs to both of us as a married couple." The cruelty was breathtaking. They were using the legal system as a weapon, filing multiple lawsuits designed to overwhelm us with legal fees and court appearances, while they positioned themselves as the reasonable parties trying to protect everyone's interests. That afternoon, James Patterson called with more bad news. "Norman, they've filed an emergency motion asking the court to freeze all your assets pending the guardianship hearing. They're claiming you might try to hide or transfer money to avoid their legitimate claims." "Can they do that?" "If the judge believes you're incompetent, yes. The hearing is scheduled for Monday morning. We have 4 days to build a defense." Friday brought a new horror. 2 police officers appeared at my door with a welfare check request. "Mr. Holloway, we received a call from your family members expressing concern about your well-being. They said you've been making threats against them and behaving erratically." The officers were professional and polite, but I could see them evaluating my mental state as we talked. They asked questions about my daily routine, whether I was taking any medications, whether I felt safe in my own home. "Sir, your son-in-law mentioned that you've been having paranoid thoughts about people trying to steal from you. Is that accurate?" I showed them the legal documents the Morrison family had filed, explaining the actual situation, but I could see doubt in their eyes. To them, it probably looked like a sad family dispute involving an elderly man who might not be thinking clearly. After they left, I called James again. "This is psychological warfare," I told him. "They're attacking from every angle, trying to make me look unstable." "It's also illegal," James said. "Filing false police reports, creating fraudulent psychological evaluations, defamation through social media. We have grounds for criminal charges." "How long will that take?" "Months, maybe years, and in the meantime they could succeed in having you declared incompetent." That's when I realized that traditional legal channels might not be enough. The Morrison family was playing a sophisticated game, using the system's bias toward protecting vulnerable adults against me. They were betting that a judge would rather err on the side of caution than risk leaving an incompetent elderly man in control of his own finances. Saturday morning, I made a decision that Katie would have understood. I called Haley into my office and pulled out the envelope she'd never seen before. "Sweetheart, it's time you knew the truth about your mother's inheritance." Haley frowned. "Dad, I know about Mom's life insurance policy. It paid off the house." "That's not what I'm talking about." I opened the envelope and showed her Katie's letter, the investment statements, the trust documents. As she read through everything, her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, shock, disbelief, and finally understanding. $8,200,000, she whispered. Your mother was a very smart woman. She invested her inheritance from her mother, lived below her means, and spent 30 years building a fortune that nobody knew about. Haley looked up at me with wide eyes. Dad, if Blake had known about this, he would have killed us both, I said simply. The truth hung in the air between us. The Morrison family thought they were stealing a few $100,000 from a lonely widower. They had no idea they'd stumbled onto a fortune that dwarfed anything they'd stolen before. What are we going to do? Haley asked. I thought about Katie's final instructions, about the tests she'd wanted me to apply to determine who could be trusted. The Morrison family had failed that test spectacularly. We're going to give them exactly what they want, I said. What do you mean? Monday morning, at the guardianship hearing, I'm going to let them win. Haley stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Dad, if they get guardianship, they'll control everything. They'll control what they think is everything. I smiled for the first time in days. But they have no idea what they're really asking for. That weekend, James Patterson and I worked out the details of what would become the most expensive lesson in greed that the Morrison family would ever receive. By Monday morning, I was ready. The Morrison family thought they were about to steal a modest inheritance from a helpless old man. Instead, they were about to discover that sometimes the greatest victories come with the highest prices, and $8,200,000 was about to teach them that some families aren't worth joining. Sunday night, as I sat in Katie's garden listening to the evening sounds of our neighborhood, I whispered to the roses that still bloomed in her memory, "Tomorrow, sweetheart, tomorrow they find out who they really tried to steal from." The roses seemed to nod in the gentle breeze, as if Katie herself was giving her approval for what was about to happen. Justice, it turned out, had been waiting 18 months for the right moment to strike, and that moment was less than 12 hours away. The courtroom was exactly what I'd expected. Dark wood paneling, fluorescent lights that made everyone look sickly, and the kind of institutional atmosphere that was designed to intimidate rather than comfort. Judge Margaret Chen presided from behind an imposing bench, reviewing the stack of documents that the Morrison family's lawyer had filed. David Morrison, Blake's uncle, sat at the plaintiff's table with his clients arranged around him like a well-rehearsed ensemble cast. Blake wore a conservative suit and an expression of concerned responsibility. His parents flanked him, looking like the kind of upstanding citizens who would never take advantage of anyone. At the defendant's table, James Patterson and I sat quietly while the Morrison family presented their case for why I should be declared incompetent and placed under their guardianship. David Morrison was good at his job. He painted a picture of a grieving widower who'd lost his grip on reality after his wife's death. He presented the fabricated psychological evaluation as evidence of my mental decline. He had Blake testify about my paranoid accusations and financial confusion. Your Honor, David Morrison said in closing, this is a heartbreaking situation, but it's exactly why guardianship laws exist. Mr. Holloway is a vulnerable adult who needs protection from his own deteriorating judgment. My clients are asking for nothing more than the authority to ensure his financial security and well-being. Judge Chen looked down at me from her bench. Mr. Holloway, do you understand what's being requested here? I stood up slowly, playing the part of a confused elderly man. I think so, Your Honor. They want to help me manage my money because they think I can't do it myself. And how do you feel about that? I glanced at Haley, who was sitting in the gallery behind me. She gave me an encouraging nod, though I could see the worry in her eyes. Well, Your Honor, I suppose if that's what the family thinks is best. I let my voice trail off uncertainly. David Morrison smiled like a predator who'd just cornered his prey. Your Honor, James Patterson stood up. Before any decisions are made, I think the court should have complete information about Mr. Holloway's financial situation. Judge Chen frowned. What do you mean? I mean that the petitioners may not fully understand what they're asking to control. David Morrison objected. Your Honor, we've done extensive research into Mr. Holloway's finances. He has a modest pension, owns his home, and has minimal savings. This is exactly the kind of limited estate that requires professional management. James smiled. With the court's permission, I'd like to present evidence of Mr. Holloway's actual financial position. Judge Chen looked intrigued. Proceed. James walked to the evidence table and picked up a folder that contained copies of all of Katie's financial documents. Your Honor, the petitioners are requesting guardianship over an estate they believe to be worth approximately $200,000. They are incorrect. He handed copies to the judge and to David Morrison. I watched as both of them scanned the first page, then stopped and read more carefully. Judge Chen's eyebrows rose. Mr. Patterson, are these documents authentic? Yes, Your Honor. These are certified copies of investment statements, trust documents, and bank records. Mr. Holloway's late wife, Catherine Holloway, was the beneficiary of a family trust that she managed very carefully for over 30 years. David Morrison was flipping through pages, his face growing paler with each document. I could see him calculating figures, realizing the scope of what his family thought they were about to control. Your Honor, James continued, the estate in question is worth $8,200,000. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Blake's mouth actually fell open. His parents looked like they'd been struck by lightning. Even Judge Chen seemed taken aback by the number. Mr. Patterson, the judge said carefully, are you saying that the petitioners are asking for guardianship over an $8 million estate? That's correct, Your Honor. David Morrison stood up shakily. Your Honor, this information changes nothing. Regardless of the estate's size, our concern is Mr. Holloway's mental competence. Actually, James said, it changes everything. He walked to the evidence table again and picked up another folder. This one contained all the evidence Haley had collected from Blake's home office. Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that this guardianship petition is part of a systematic fraud scheme targeting vulnerable elderly adults. The next hour was devastating for the Morrison family. James methodically presented Blake's research files, the timeline of their operation, the email exchanges about previous victims, even the photograph of me taken through my kitchen window. Blake tried to maintain his composure, but I could see sweat beading on his forehead as James revealed the full scope of their criminal enterprise. Your Honor, James said, holding up the newspaper clipping about the Portland widow, this is a pattern of behavior. The Morrison family identifies wealthy elderly targets, infiltrates their families through romantic relationships, then uses guardianship proceedings to gain legal control of their assets. Judge Chen was no longer looking sympathetic toward the Morrison family. Mr. Morrison, are you saying that your client married Mr. Holloway's daughter as part of a scheme to steal his money? David Morrison was frantically conferring with his clients in whispers. Finally, he stood up. Your Honor, these allegations are completely unfounded. My client married for love, not money. Then why? James asked. Did he research Mr. Holloway's finances before proposing to his daughter? He presented the timeline from Blake's files. Target identified 3 weeks after Katie's death notice. Financial research completed 2 months later. Marriage proposal 6 months after that. Your Honor, this wasn't a romance. It was a business plan. Blake finally snapped. He jumped to his feet, his careful composure completely gone. You don't understand. He doesn't need that money. He's an old man living alone in a house that's too big for him. Why should he sit on $8 million when people like me are working our asses off just to get by? The outburst was everything James had hoped for. Blake had just confessed to the judge that he knew about the money and felt entitled to it. Mr. Morrison, Judge Chen said coldly, please control your client. But Blake wasn't done. The stress of the hearing, combined with the shock of learning how much money was actually at stake, had broken his ability to maintain the facade. This whole thing is ridiculous. We've spent months planning this, invested our own money in research and legal fees, and now you're acting like we're criminals because we want to help family manage their finances. David Morrison was trying to get Blake to sit down and shut up, but it was too late. "Your Honor," James said quietly, "I think Mr. Morrison just explained his motivation quite clearly." Judge Chen looked at the Morrison family with undisguised disgust. "Mr. Morrison, I'm denying your petition for guardianship. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation." She turned to me. "Mr. Holloway, I apologize that you and your daughter have been subjected to this attempted fraud. You are clearly competent to manage your own affairs." As the judge left the courtroom, the Morrison family sat in stunned silence. Their elaborate scheme had not only failed, but had exposed them to serious criminal charges. Blake turned to look at me, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "This isn't over, old man." "Yes," I said quietly, "it is." Outside the courthouse, Haley threw her arms around me. "Dad, I can't believe you let them think they were going to win." "Your mother always said that sometimes the best way to catch a predator is to let them think they've cornered their prey." James Patterson joined us on the courthouse steps. "Norman, the district attorney's office will want to interview you and Haley about the Morrison family's activities. They're looking at charges including elder abuse, conspiracy, fraud, and filing false police reports." I nodded, but my mind was already moving beyond the legal proceedings. The Morrison family would face justice, but that wasn't what mattered most to me. "James, I want to set up a trust for Haley, something they can never touch no matter what happens." That afternoon, we went back to my house and sat in Katie's garden while I told Haley everything about her mother's financial wisdom and the tests she'd wanted me to apply to the people in our lives. "She knew something like this might happen?" Haley asked. "Your mother was a very good judge of character. She always said that money reveals people's true nature." "The Morrison family certainly proved that." I looked at the roses Katie had planted, still blooming faithfully despite everything that had happened. "The most important thing your mother taught me was that family isn't about blood or marriage certificates. It's about the people who stand by you when everything falls apart." Haley leaned against my shoulder the way she had when she was little. "I'm sorry I didn't see through Blake sooner. You saw through him when it mattered. That's what saved us both." 6 months later, Blake Morrison was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for elder fraud and conspiracy. His parents received 3 years each. Charlotte and Marcus, who had cooperated with investigators, received probation and community service. The Morrison family's other victims, identified through the evidence Haley had found, finally got their day in court. Some of them recovered portions of what had been stolen from them. As for me, I used part of Katie's inheritance to establish a foundation that helps elderly victims of financial fraud. The rest went into a trust that will eventually provide Haley and her future children with security and independence. The house is quieter now, with just me and Katie's roses for company. But it's a peaceful quiet, not the lonely silence I'd lived with after she first passed away. Sometimes in the evenings I sit in the garden and tell Katie about my day, about the foundation's work, about Haley's new job at a nonprofit organization, about the small victories we've achieved against the predators who target vulnerable people. And sometimes when the wind moves through her roses just right, I could swear I hear her laughing. "You did good, Norman," the wind seems to whisper. "You protected our girl and you made them pay for underestimating us." The Morrison family had been wrong about many things. They'd been wrong about my mental competence. They'd been wrong about my willingness to fight back. They'd been wrong about the size of the fortune they were trying to steal. But their biggest mistake had been underestimating the power of a love that transcends death. Katie's final gift to me hadn't just been money. It had been the wisdom to recognize the difference between people who love you and people who want to use you. And in the end, that wisdom had been worth far more than $8,200,000. Though I had to admit the money hadn't hurt either.